Picture this: a quiet Texas ranch at sunset, the calm shattered as a ruthless biker gang storms the gates, engines roaring, guns blazing. At the heart of the chaos stands Eve Beauregard, a humble widow who quickly reveals she's no ordinary rancher. Armed only with courage, military-grade tactics, and fierce determination, she wages a one-woman war to defend her land. It's Yellowstone meets Unforgiven, an action-packed showdown in true American style, where justice and grit go hand in hand. But can Eve stand alone against these outlaws? Or will Crescent Gulch fall under their shadow? Stay tuned and listen closely as Eve's hidden past unfolds in a gripping tale of bravery, honor, and cowboy combat you won't forget. Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell for more explosive Western thrillers that'll keep you right at the edge of your seat. Under the sprawling Texan sky, the dusty horizon stretched out like a silent pledge of opportunity and solitude. On the edge of this vast expanse of open land stood a modest ranch, one that most folks in the nearest town, Crescent Gulch, barely paid any heed to. The ranch was owned by a woman named Evelyn Eve Beauregard, a widow with silver-streaked hair, a slight frame, and a gaze that often drifted across the fence lines as though scanning for something no one else could see. At a glance, Eve seemed like any other humble rancher surviving day by day, feeding her livestock and keeping the property in barely workable condition. Yet there was a certain composure about her that defied her apparent fragility. Locals might notice how Eve's posture never slumped, even when she was carrying heavy sacks of feed on her shoulders, or how her eyes, flecked with bits of gold, would shift with the speed of someone who knew how to read a room. Like she was constantly assessing possible threats. Even so, no one in Crescent Gulch truly understood her. Ever since her husband passed away from a ranch accident a few years back, or so she claimed, it seemed like a piece of her heart had died along with him. However, she never spoke ill of her late spouse, nor did she mention her own past in anything more than half sentences. The hardware store clerk once recalled Eve slipping about how times used to be rough in New Mexico, but the conversation ended as quickly as it started. Rumors circulated that Eve might have been involved in something more dangerous than ranching or traveling from one state to another. The older folks, those with a sharper eye for detail, swore they saw the calluses of a lifetime on Eve's hands, not just from farm labor, but something else, something that came from holding more than just the reins of a horse. People whispered she might have served in the military, or that she once roamed the roads as a bounty hunter. Yet no one knew for sure, and she never offered clarifications. Out at her ranch, life was peaceful if austere. Apart from the occasional coyote scurrying in the distance, or the lazy swirl of dust devils across the fields, nothing much disrupted her days. She rose with the dawn, walked through the creaking porch to feed her goats and horses, then tended to the neglected orchard of pecan trees. Eve had no close friends, no visitors, and no appetite for unnecessary conversation. A scrawny cat named Stripes was her sole companion, prowling about the barn in search of mice. The humdrum routine she maintained was its own fortress, designed to keep prying eyes away and to bury any ghosts from her past. Until, that is, whispers of trouble began drifting into Crescent Gulch. A local radio broadcast touched upon a growing presence of a rowdy biker gang known as the Cold Iron Crew. Reports suggested they had started to expand their territory through intimidation and small-time extortion. They targeted lonely highways, shaking down travelers, pressing local businesses for protection fees. But nobody knew exactly why they would look twice at a place so remote and unremarkable as Crescent Gulch. People speculated maybe there were hidden routes for smuggling, or maybe the group was just bored and wanted easy prey. Though concerned, folks in town carried on, hoping it was all just another rumor that would blow away with the tumbleweeds. But Eve, perpetually watchful, was different. She started noticing tracks of motorcycles on the dusty roads near her property. Empty beer cans and cigarette butts appeared on the outskirts of her ranch. At dusk, she heard unfamiliar engines revving in the distance. Most people might have dismissed it as the echo of passing travelers. Eve, however, felt her instincts flare up. This was no random visit. Something was stirring, something that would change the course of her quiet life on this patch of land forever. Despite the growing unease in the air, life in Crescent Gulch continued as it always had, slow, predictable, and reliant on neighborly trust. The local diner served black coffee and pecan pie from dawn to dusk. The old barber shop at the corner specialized in dusty haircuts and local gossip. Even the town's tiny library hosted its weekly reading circle without interruption. But behind all that normalcy, people were getting restless. Nervous glances were exchanged at the grocery store whenever a stranger walked in. Older men spent more time sitting on the veranda of the barbershop, making sure that nothing seemed amiss on Main Street. The younger crowd, fearless in their naivete, occasionally ventured out to see if they could catch a glimpse of these rumored outlaws who might be prowling about. Yet no one could say for certain if the Cold Iron crew had actually arrived, or if they were just swirling in the local gossip mill. Meanwhile, Eve approached each day with a heightened vigilance. She repaired fences that didn't need repairing and inspected the perimeter of her property as the sun set every evening, ensuring that gates were locked and feed barrels were secured. She even took to patrolling her land with a flashlight and a pair of binoculars, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. This was more than ordinary caution. It was the behavior of someone who had faced threats before and learned the importance of never being caught unprepared. Hidden in her barn was a locked trunk that no one had ever seen her open. Most people would assume it contained old photo albums or keepsakes from her late husband's days. But once, in the dead of night, Eve rolled that trunk out from under a secret compartment in the floorboards. She opened it slowly, revealing a collection of items that hinted at a shadowy past. A battered U.S. cavalry hat from decades ago, a service pistol with the serial numbers partially scratched off, and a photograph of a younger Eve dressed in a desert camouflage uniform, standing side by side with men and women sporting medals and stripes of high rank. Eve's hand trembled slightly as she traced her finger along the edges of that photo, remembering a time when her identity was something far more formidable than just the ranch widow. She clenched her jaw, then gently packed everything away, as though sealing a door to memories that threatened to flood back. In town, a grizzled old war veteran named Jacob Leary observed Eve's subtle changes. He'd known her in passing for a few years and suspected something about her that didn't fit the usual rancher's profile. Jacob was wheelchair-bound from an injury he'd sustained long ago, and he spent much of his time near the main street, studying passers-by with a discerning gaze. He'd spotted the way Eve's steps always had a certain deliberate precision. He noticed how she never turned her head carelessly. She pivoted her entire body as though expecting an ambush. As rumors about the Cold Iron crew's encroachment grew louder, he watched Eve become more reclusive, slipping into town at odd hours to pick up supplies, then disappearing again before anyone could get too curious. One afternoon, Jacob attempted to greet her, only to see her politely nod and slip away without engaging in conversation. Something about her told him she was bracing for a storm that no one else could see on the horizon just yet. Still, the tension was subtle, a faint electric current in the air that could easily be ignored by those untrained in recognizing danger. Life went on, with church bells ringing on Sunday and the local kids playing ball after school. Yet a sense of impending confrontation was brewing, quietly in the background. All it would take was a single spark, one brazen move by the Cold Iron crew or an unlucky encounter, to set off a chain of events that would remind Crescent Gulch that not everyone is as they appear, and that beneath calm surfaces, deep undercurrents of wariness and skill can lie dormant, waiting for the moment they need to surge forth. That spark arrived one afternoon when an unfamiliar motorcycle roared down Crescent Gulch's dusty main thoroughfare. The rider was a lean, tattoo-laden man, wearing a leather vest emblazoned with a stylized iron horse head on the back. The few folks loitering around the post office and the barber shop watched in tense silence as he slowly cruised by, his eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. He didn't stop at the diner or the gas station. Instead, he kept going until he reached the outskirts of town, where the roads narrowed and signs for private properties started appearing. According to rumor, he was seen turning onto a long dirt path that led into the more remote ranch lands, land that included Eve's property. Eve was out back feeding her horses when the distant rumble of the motorcycle drifted toward her. By the time the rider reached the faded wooden gate that bore her family's name, Beauregard Ranch, she was already standing on her porch, arms folded calmly across her chest, eyes narrowed. The stranger brought his bike to a halt, engine idling loudly. He offered a mocking salute before flipping up his sunglasses, revealing eyes that held a mix of amusement and predatory intent. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he drawled, his voice carrying a false politeness. "Name's Gavin. I was hoping to talk business with the owner of this ranch." "That you?" Eve didn't flinch. She simply studied his vest, noticing the iron horse emblem that matched the local rumors about the Cold Iron crew. She nodded once. "I am. You're trespassing. State your purpose, then get." Gavin chuckled, a raspy, unsettling sound. "You see, my crew, we're looking for a bit of elbow room. We've taken a liking to some of the quiet spots around here. This piece of land you got, well, it might fit into our plans just right." He leaned forward on his bike. "Ever consider selling?" The direct approach was so brazen, it almost amused her. Eve's expression, however, remained impassive. "Not for sale," she said simply. "Let me rephrase," Gavin continued, a menacing undertone seeping into his voice. "We're offering you a chance to walk away with your pockets a bit fuller. This place, it's too big for a single widow to handle, ain't it?" His gaze flicked around the property, taking note of the barn, the small orchard, and the open pasture. "You got a month, maybe 2, to think it over. Otherwise, my associates might come down here and help you decide." For a moment, silence stretched between them. In that quiet, Eve's mind churned with old instincts. Assess the threat, gauge potential allies, plan multiple contingencies. She gave a slight tilt of her head, almost imperceptible, as she glanced at the tire tracks Gavin's bike had left behind in the dirt. Finally, she responded in a measured tone. "I don't know you, Gavin, and you sure as hell don't know me. Ride on out of here before I call the sheriff." Gavin paused, seemingly weighing whether to push further or heed her warning. He forced a grin, revved the motorcycle, and spun his back wheel, kicking up a cloud of dust that enveloped the porch. "Suit yourself," he shouted over the roar of the engine. Then he was gone, leaving Eve to stare at the space where he had been, dust settling slowly on the old boards under her feet. Though the confrontation was brief, it confirmed every suspicion she'd had. The Cold Iron crew had arrived, and they had their sights set on her ranch for reasons she could only guess. Perhaps they wanted to set up a hideout or smuggling route, or maybe they just liked the idea of intimidating a lone woman. Regardless, Eve knew this was only the beginning. She headed inside to brew some coffee and calm her nerves, heart pounding with a mix of anger and the kind of adrenaline she'd hoped never to feel again. Word of Gavin's visit spread through Crescent Gulch like a brush fire. Gossip traveled fast in a small town, and soon folks were murmuring that the Cold Iron crew was finally making good on their reputation. At the local diner, patrons leaned across booths, whispering speculations about how many bikers might be holed up in abandoned cabins around the area or in a remote campsite along the highway. The diner's owner, Margie, nervously wiped down the counter, recalling stories she'd heard from truckers passing through. Stories of roadhouse brawls and collections that left unsuspecting business owners in ruin. Over at the gas station, the attendant, a teenage boy named Travis, recounted to anyone who would listen how he saw a group of riders crossing the state line just last week. They were heavily armed, he insisted, though no one could verify the claim. Meanwhile, Eve remained unnervingly calm. She made her usual supply run to town, but limited her conversation to curt nods and brief hellos. Anyone who mustered the courage to ask about Gavin's visit got a quick, all handled, and nothing more. However, she did purchase an unusually large amount of canned goods, bottled water, and, most notably, several sacks of something unmarked that she picked up at the local feed store. She paid in cash, loaded everything herself, and sped back to her ranch before dusk could settle. That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon to find her meticulously reinforcing the locks on her barn. Inside the barn, she hauled out the trunk from its hidden nook once again. She opened it, letting the moonlight spill across items that spoke of a life far removed from quiet ranching. Old tactical gear, a set of spurs that had been modified with small, sharp edges, and a rifle that bore the faint scarring of countless hours in harsh conditions. In another compartment, she retrieved a few small containers, each filled with carefully maintained ammunition. She ran her fingers along the rifle's barrel, testing the weight and balance. A wave of memories rushed through her mind. Boot camp training, desert nights, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the adrenaline surge of conflict. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. This was a part of her she had locked away years ago, preferring the solace of wide skies and open fields to the tumult of violence. But if her land and her safety were threatened, she would do what needed to be done. Out on the ranch, the night air was cool and tinged with the scent of mesquite. Stripes, her cat, wound around her legs as she stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness with alert eyes. She clicked on a powerful flashlight, sweeping its beam across the fence line. In the faint glow, she spotted fresh tire tracks near the edge of her property, the same distinct pattern Gavin's bike had. The message was clear. She was being watched, maybe even followed. A dark form on the horizon caught her eye, but upon closer inspection, it was just one of her horses wandering near a fence post. Still, her mind buzzed with the memory of conflict from years past. Eve had never wanted that life again, and yet fate seemed to be steering her back into a place where stealth and cunning might be the difference between security and ruin. She wondered if it might be wise to call the sheriff in advance, but a quiet voice inside reminded her that the local authorities might not be prepared to handle a well-organized biker gang. Perhaps they would send a deputy or two for a cursory look, but the Cold Iron crew would see that as a joke, an invitation to escalate. No, if she was going to face them, she had to do so on her own terms, or at least with allies who understood the reality of combat. With the moon climbing higher, Eve locked down every door and window, then headed to her bedroom. Exhaustion tugged at her, but she knew sleep would not come easily. Too many possibilities spun through her head, each one culminating in an image of roaring bikes and malicious eyes set on taking what was hers. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting the silence envelop her. In that quiet, she made a decision she had hoped never to make again. She would prepare for a fight, whatever it took, because no one was going to drive her off her own land. The next morning, Eve woke before sunrise and set about her task with a methodical efficiency. She started by double-checking the perimeter of her ranch, scanning for any more signs of intrusion. The tracks were still there, but no new ones had appeared overnight. That was a small comfort, but she knew it wouldn't last. Returning to the barn, she rummaged through the trunk again, this time pulling out a carefully folded cloth that contained items of more personal significance. Old dog tags, a small silver cross, and a battered photo of her late husband. The man in the picture had a rugged kindness in his eyes, the kind that made him a natural caretaker for the land they had once managed together. Eve traced the outline of his face, feeling a pang of loss that time had never quite dulled. She remembered how she and her husband had originally purchased the ranch as a way to escape the chaos they both had experienced in their younger years. They wanted a future where their children, had they been blessed with any, would grow up learning how to care for horses and fix fences instead of learning how to dismantle a weapon. But fate had other plans. Medical complications meant they would never have children, and a tragic accident robbed her of her husband far too soon. Or so she had told everyone. The truth was more complicated, hidden behind layers of half-lies and omissions that she kept for her own protection. Even so, she had learned to love this land, to breathe with it, to speak to it in her heart, and she'd be damned if she would let some motorcycle bullies take it away. As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, Eve carried her rifle out to a secluded part of her property, an area heavily shielded by tall, ragged oaks. There she set up makeshift targets, tin cans and bottles stacked on hay bales, along with some old wooden planks. She hadn't fired a gun in months, maybe years, but the moment she leveled her weapon, her muscles remembered. The crisp morning air shattered with each shot, the recoil resonating through her body like a familiar dance. Her accuracy remained dead on. Cans clanged and bottles exploded into shards. With each pull of the trigger, she felt a part of herself unlocking, reconnecting with skills she had once honed to survive in a harsh, unforgiving world. She breathed out, letting the last echo of gunfire fade into the rustle of leaves. In the distance, she heard a neighbor's rooster crow, likely Old Man Pearson's farm, situated a couple of miles away. Though neighbor was a loose term in this rural sprawl, she felt a momentary pang of guilt, hoping she wasn't stirring unnecessary alarm with her early morning target practice. Still, she continued, determined to sharpen her reflexes. She put away the rifle and moved to a smaller handgun, cycling through quick-draw drills she had memorized years before. Each motion was a muscle memory exercise, an old habit from a time when readiness could mean the difference between living and dying. By the time the sun fully crested, Eve was drenched in sweat, heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and excitement. She found herself whispering half-forgotten mantras from her days of training, a calming routine to steady her nerves. After packing up her gear, she returned to the barn, carefully cleaning and oiling each weapon. Then she replaced them in the trunk, locking it with a steel padlock. This was only the start, a small taste of the vigilance she would need if the Cold Iron crew decided to push their luck. With that done, she made herself a simple breakfast, eggs and toast, plus a fresh cup of coffee, trying to maintain at least some semblance of her ordinary routine. But beneath the mundane actions, her mind churned, forming potential plans of defense and escape routes. She considered the possibility of recruiting help from the outside. But who would believe her story enough to risk standing up to a biker gang? And even if they did, was it right to drag them into a conflict that could get deadly? Eve swallowed hard, staring into her coffee mug. She needed time to think, time to strategize. Because once the Cold Iron crew made their next move, she had a feeling it would come fast and hard. Later that day, a dusty pickup truck ambled up her driveway. It was Jacob Leary, the old war veteran who used a wheelchair. Eve watched from the porch, rifle tucked discreetly behind a rocking chair, as he carefully parked, using hand controls to navigate the vehicle. Curious and a tad wary, Eve walked out to greet him. She noticed Jacob eyeing the property with the sort of attentiveness that suggested he knew something was amiss. He cleared his throat. "Afternoon, Eve. Heard you had a visitor yesterday. Figured I'd swing by and check on you. Town's been talking." Eve nodded, keeping her face neutral. "Appreciate your concern, Jacob. Everything's fine." She gestured for him to roll up closer. "You want some water? Coffee?" "Water's good, Washanan," he replied. A sheen of sweat dotted his forehead, either from the Texas heat or from the tension in the air. Possibly both. She disappeared inside for a moment, returning with a glass of cold water. Handing it to him, she noticed how his gaze flicked to the rifle leaning against the wall. He said nothing about it but took a sip before continuing. "You know, back when I served, I learned a thing or two about dealing with bullies. They come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they wear a uniform, sometimes they ride bikes. But their tactics, usually the same." Eve raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Jacob nodded. "They sniff out weakness, or what they perceive as weakness. Then they capitalize on it. If they think they can scare you, they will. If that fails, they'll escalate until they get what they want or until someone teaches them a hard lesson. Word around town is, you're not too keen on giving up your land." He paused, taking another sip. "I respect that, but I also know we don't have much of a police force here, and the county sheriff's got bigger fish to fry in the next district." "I'm not relying on them," Eve said bluntly. She felt a rush of relief that she didn't have to pretend with Jacob. He was the one person who might understand, even if only partially. He nodded thoughtfully. "That's probably wise. I've seen these fellas around the outskirts crossing state lines. They ain't just any old biker club. They've got connections, drug running, arms dealing, the works. If they want your land, there's gotta be a reason. Maybe a strategic location, a place to stash goods, or just a new territory to control." He paused, casting a glance toward the horizon. "Either way, you're in their crosshairs." Eve folded her arms across her chest, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't need validation to prepare herself. She just didn't know how far the Cold Iron crew would go. "I'm aware," she finally replied, her voice steady, "and I'm not giving them an inch." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, as if searching her eyes for something. "I had a feeling you'd say that. Listen, I may not be able to waltz into a firefight like I used to, but I still got my aim, and some old gear from my service days. If it comes down to it, I could offer you an extra set of eyes and maybe a bullet or two. Not saying we form a vigilante squad, but sometimes it helps to have backup, especially when you're dealing with people who only understand force." In that moment, Eve felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. Camaraderie. Still, she hesitated. Involving Jacob meant putting him at risk, and she didn't know if she could live with that. But looking at his determined expression, she realized he'd already made up his mind. She nodded slowly, pressing her lips together in a thin line. "Thank you," she said simply, hoping that would suffice for now. Jacob drained the last of his water and handed the glass back. You've got my number. Don't be shy about calling. And Eve, he added, shifting the truck into gear. Watch your six. She watched him drive away, feeling equal parts grateful and anxious. Having a potential ally was a comfort, but it also meant that any move she made from here on out might drag him into the line of fire. With the sun casting long shadows across her property, Eve turned and gazed at the open land she was determined to protect. The world she had tried so hard to keep at bay was closing in fast, and now she was forced to become someone she had hoped never to be again. A fighter, a guardian, someone prepared to wield violence if it meant safeguarding what mattered most. That evening, clouds gathered in the sky, heavy with the promise of rain. A rare event in these parts. The wind picked up, whistling through the eaves of Eve's old ranch house, rattling loose shutters. She stood on the porch, scanning the horizon as lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the rolling plains in stark white flashes. Each burst of light revealed silhouettes of fence posts, swaying trees, and beyond them, the vague impression of a world where potential threats lurked just out of sight. As the storm approached, Eve's mind churned with restless energy. She paced the length of the porch, each footstep echoing the dull rumble of thunder. Memories of her past life came swirling up. Moments of tense nights in foreign deserts, the hum of aircraft overhead, the metallic tang of a loaded gun in her hands. She remembered how she had once been part of a team, a cohesive unit that had each other's backs no matter the odds. But now she was alone in a different kind of war zone, her own home, turned into a potential battleground. She tried to push the memories away, focusing instead on what needed to be done right here, right now. A sudden crack of thunder made Stripes the cat scamper inside. Eve followed, locking the door behind her. She had spent much of the day strategizing, drawing crude maps of her land on sheets of paper. She noted vantage points, areas of cover, potential choke points. If the bikers came en masse, she needed to funnel them into spots where she could hold them off more easily. She also considered fallback positions: the barn, the orchard, the root cellar below her house. None of these places were designed for combat, but they could offer temporary sanctuary if she needed to retreat. The idea of open warfare on her ranch sent a chill down her spine, but she couldn't dismiss it. The Cold Iron crew had the numbers, and probably the firepower, to strong-arm just about anyone they wanted. They didn't strike her as the type to give up because she said no once. That meant she had to stay alert, not just physically but mentally. She thought about calling a few distant acquaintances, people she'd served with, just to have a network of seasoned allies. But the notion of dragging them into her personal battle made her hesitate. Most of them had families or had moved on to quiet lives, much like she tried to do. No, that option was a last resort. Outside, the wind lashed against the walls, and rain began to pelt the roof in heavy droplets. Lightning struck closer now, accompanied by immediate thunder that rattled the window panes. Eve took a seat at her kitchen table, the single overhead bulb flickering from the storm's interference. She spread out her maps and diagrams, then began labeling each area with possible defensive strategies. She considered booby traps, rudimentary ones she could set up without drawing too much attention. Maybe a few tripwires with loud alarms to startle the intruders, or scattered nail strips that could puncture tires. Nothing lethal outright, at least not yet, but enough to send a message. She was so engrossed in her planning that she almost didn't hear the rumble of engines over the storm. Almost. The moment her ears picked up on that distinct growl of motorcycles, she froze, heart hammering. Was it the Cold Iron crew again, braving the weather to make a statement? Or just a bunch of unfortunate travelers caught in the downpour? Grabbing her rifle, she killed the lights and moved to the nearest window. Through sheets of rain, she could see faint headlights bobbing along the distant road. The motorcycles didn't stop at her gate this time. They roared past, heading deeper into the rural expanse beyond her ranch. Relief seeped into her chest, though it was tinged with anxiety. The storm might have deterred a confrontation tonight, but it wouldn't wash away the threat entirely. With a sigh, Eve turned back to her maps, every roll of thunder reminding her that time was slipping away. The Cold Iron crew had given her a deadline of a month or two, but criminals like them often didn't stick to polite timetables. She resolved to be ready for anything, no matter when they decided to come. Morning arrived with the air still thick from the previous night's storm. Small pools of rainwater glimmered in the early sunlight, and the freshly washed fields had a renewed vibrancy. Despite the calmer weather, an uneasy tension weighed on Eve's mind. She stood by her porch, sipping black coffee, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The distant hum of insects and the occasional crow of a rooster were the only sounds. After breakfast, she decided to head into town for some crucial errands. She loaded her truck with a bag of old scrap metal, an excuse to visit the town's junkyard, and made her way down the muddy roads. The drive gave her time to think. She passed by fields of cattle and weather-beaten barns, each testament to the rugged life that had defined this region for generations. For a moment, she felt a wave of affection for this place and its steadfast simplicity. Then her thoughts turned to the cold iron crew, and her grip on the steering wheel tightened. It infuriated her that these thugs thought they could roll into a peaceful community and bend it to their will. Upon reaching Crescent Gulch, she noticed subtle signs of heightened alertness. People glanced over their shoulders more often, and there seemed to be fewer folks hanging around on porches. The local diner had a small crowd, but the laughter inside sounded forced, as if everyone was trying to pretend everything was normal. Outside the general store, Margie was chatting with a customer, her arms folded tightly over her apron. Eve nodded a greeting, not stopping to talk. Her priority was the junkyard. When she arrived, the owner, a gruff, middle-aged man named Rodney, was elbow-deep in the engine of an old sedan. He straightened up at the sight of Eve. "Well, morning to you. Brought me some scrap, I see," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Eve hopped out of her truck. "Yep. Figured you might find some use for it, or at least get a few bucks out of it as salvage." She tossed a glance around the yard, noting rusted car frames, old metal drums, twisted piles of rebar. If she were creative, she could fashion some effective defenses out of junk like this. She just had to figure out how to transport it discreetly. Rodney grunted in appreciation. "Business has been slow, what with rumors of trouble on the roads. Folks ain't traveling as much. You hear any talk about those biker fellas causing a stir?" He asked it casually, but there was a tension in his eyes that mirrored the rest of the townspeople. Eve shrugged, feigning indifference. "Heard some stories, yeah. Don't pay much mind." Rodney mumbled, clearly unconvinced. He motioned for one of his workers to come help unload the scrap. Meanwhile, Eve wandered deeper into the junkyard, ostensibly looking for a spare part for her own truck. In truth, she was scanning for anything that might serve her defensive plans: heavy chains, steel plating, or a decent length of barbed wire. As she stepped around a toppled stack of tires, she spotted exactly what she was hoping for: a large coil of razor wire, partially buried beneath old car parts. She felt her heart quicken. That could be used to fortify her fence line or even set up a perimeter alarm. Making a mental note of its location, she resolved to come back later, perhaps under cover of darkness, to purchase or borrow it if need be. She didn't want to draw too much attention right now. By the time she left the junkyard, she had negotiated a few minor items, some thick metal rods and a couple of spare hinges, claiming she needed them for barn repairs. Rodney let her have them at a low cost, clearly just glad for the business. As she drove away, she couldn't help feeling like she was planning for a battle. In truth, she was. And while that thought sat uncomfortably on her mind, it also steeled her resolve. She would do whatever it took to keep her ranch and this community safe from the looming threat. The following days passed in a tense, quiet rhythm. Crescent Gulch fell under a collective hush. People spoke softly in the diner, drivers avoided certain back roads, and local gossip turned almost exclusively to speculation about the cold iron crew. Yet the bikers themselves maintained a curious distance. They were around all right. Now and then, a group of riders would be spotted on the horizon, or a local would mention seeing them at an out-of-the-way bar off Route 17. But they didn't flood into town the way everyone had feared. Instead, it was more like they were circling, assessing, biding their time. Eve took advantage of the lull to continue her fortifications. Late at night, under the cover of darkness, she would drive out to the junkyard with her truck's headlights off. Rodney, never one to pry, allowed her to pick through the scrap piles in exchange for whatever small payment she could offer. Most nights, she returned to her ranch hauling materials that were far from standard ranch equipment: coils of razor wire, sheets of corrugated metal, lengths of heavy chain. She toiled in the moonlight, installing makeshift barricades along possible entry points, and setting up a few tripwire alarms with old tin cans that would rattle loudly if anyone came snooping around. During the daylight hours, she pretended life was normal. She fed her livestock, tended the orchard, and made brief supply runs into town. Only Jacob seemed to notice the shadows under her eyes and the new lines of worry creasing her forehead. He didn't press her for details, respecting her silence. But there was a mutual understanding that they were on the brink of something that could shatter the fragile peace of Crescent Gulch. One afternoon, while reinforcing a portion of her fence line, Eve heard the distant rumble of motorcycles drawing closer. She immediately crouched low behind the tall grass, scanning the road through a pair of binoculars. 4 riders roared past, each wearing that signature iron horse emblem on their vests. They slowed near her property, their heads turning as though searching for signs of life. Eve's pulse pounded. Had they come to intimidate her again, or simply to scout the place? She kept perfectly still, her muscles coiled, ready to scramble for cover if they veered onto her driveway. But after a tense minute, they revved their engines and continued down the road. Eve lowered the binoculars, exhaling a shaky breath. She realized in that moment that her life had become a constant state of vigilance, a high-stakes game of waiting for the next shoe to drop. The question wasn't if the cold iron crew would come for her, but when. And in the space between her preparation and their inevitable move, she felt the weight of isolation. Despite Jacob's offer to help, she knew she stood mostly alone. The rest of the town, good-hearted though they were, lacked the means or the appetite for a serious confrontation. That night, sleep eluded her. She sat by the window, lights off, ears straining to pick up any unusual sound over the ambient chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Stripes curled up at her feet, occasionally meowing in concern. As midnight gave way to the small hours, Eve replayed in her mind the lines of defense she had set up and whether they would be enough against an organized assault. She thought about Gavin's smug face, the way he had challenged her on her own property, and her stomach twisted with anger. Maybe it was foolish, but a part of her almost wished he would come sooner rather than later, so she could put an end to this anxious waiting. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She drifted into a fitful sleep, dreams plagued by images of motorcycles tearing through the darkness, flames licking at her barn, and the echo of a gunshot that jolted her awake, heart pounding. Only then did she realize that dawn had arrived, painting the sky with pale streaks of pink and gold. Another day had begun, and with it, the uncertain countdown to whatever showdown loomed on the horizon. As the weeks stretched on, the Cold Iron Crew's presence became more overt. Occasionally, they'd roll into town in small packs, their noisy machines rattling windows and nerves alike. They lounged in front of the diner, their leather vests emblazoned with the Iron Horse, sipping coffee while the local patrons eyed them warily. Some of the more brazen bikers would make a show of throwing threatening glances at passers-by, daring anyone to challenge them. The overall tension in Crescent Gulch climbed steadily, like water rising behind a failing dam. For her part, Eve maintained a low profile. She avoided crossing paths with the bikers in town, timing her errands for early morning or late evening whenever possible. But her isolation didn't go unnoticed. On 2 separate occasions, she caught sight of headlights far off in the distance at night, lingering at the edge of her property. One time, she even heard gunshots echo across the plains, though she couldn't pinpoint the source. The Cold Iron Crew was testing boundaries, sending a message without fully engaging. They wanted her to be scared, to feel the noose tightening around her ranch. In a way, it was working. Her nights were restless, and her days were spent in constant anticipation. But fear had a way of sharpening her instincts. Each passing moment solidified her resolve to stand her ground. During one of her secret late-night excursions to fortify her fences, Eve nearly jumped out of her skin when she heard Jacob's voice call out softly from behind a stack of old tires. "Thought you might need some help," he said, rolling forward in his wheelchair with a determined expression. Eve scowled at him for a moment, but the tension melted into weary gratitude. "I'm not sure this is the place for you," she replied, gesturing at the precarious piles of junk in the moonlight. "Dangerous out here." Jacob gave a short, gruff laugh. "Life's dangerous, Eve, and we're both in it, whether we like it or not. Might as well stand together." He produced a small toolkit from his bag. "Now, where do you want this razor wire installed?" They spent the next couple of hours working in near silence, the only sounds being the rasp of metal and the nocturnal buzz of insects. Jacob's proficiency with tools surprised her, especially considering his physical limitations. She learned that he had rigged his entire house with custom modifications after his injury. Hand tools were something he handled with ease. Together they stretched the razor wire along a particularly vulnerable section of fence that bordered a narrow access road. With some ingenuity, they set up a tripwire that would yank a series of tin cans when disturbed, creating a racket sure to wake the dead, or at least alert Eve to any intruders. As they worked, Eve finally opened up a sliver. "I can't let them take this place," she murmured, tightening a clamp around the wire. "I promised myself, promised my husband, this land would be safe." Jacob paused, looking at her through the dim moonlight. "What happened to him?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, debating how much to reveal. Then she sighed. "It wasn't an accident like I tell most folks. He got involved in something dangerous, trying to protect me. He paid the price for my past. I couldn't save him." The confession hung in the night air, weighted with regret. Jacob nodded. "I'm sorry," he said simply. He didn't press further. Eve was grateful for that. They finished their task around 2 in the morning, exhaustion pulling at their bones. Before parting ways, Jacob placed a comforting hand on Eve's arm. "We'll do what needs doing. Together." Then he climbed into his truck and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Eve to contemplate the strangely comforting warmth of having an ally in her corner. In the coming days, that alliance would prove invaluable, as the Cold Iron crew began closing their net. But for this one night at least, Eve felt a faint glimmer of hope cutting through the pervasive gloom. By the third week, rumors flew that the Cold Iron crew's de facto leader, a man named Thorne, was heading into the area to personally oversee new acquisitions. Local talk suggested Thorne was a former military contractor gone rogue, a man as brutal as he was cunning. If he wanted a piece of Crescent Gulch, he'd take it by any means necessary. The knowledge that such a figure was en route cast a pall over the entire community. Businesses started closing earlier, and children were kept indoors. Fear gnawed at people's spirits like termites in old wood, slowly undermining the town's already fragile sense of security. For Eve, the news intensified her preparations. Each day she set aside time to hone her marksmanship further. She practiced quick draws, reload drills, and even set up a small obstacle course behind her barn to replicate shooting under stress. Whenever the tension in her chest felt too overwhelming, she'd pause to remember simpler moments. Her husband teaching her how to rope a calf, the two of them slow dancing in the living room on a quiet night. Then she'd push forward, fueled by the conviction that she was protecting not just land, but the memory of a love she couldn't afford to lose again. The day before Thorne was rumored to arrive, a small group of bikers rode up to her ranch at sunset. Eve counted 4 of them from her living room window. They parked their motorcycles in a semicircle on the dirt driveway, engines idling. Through the scope of her rifle, she recognized Gavin's tattoos and smug posture. 2 others looked just as rough, scarred faces, roving eyes that scanned the property as though licking their lips at a prize. The last rider was a woman with a buzz cut, her leather vest bearing a patch that read Sergeant at Arms. Eve's heart slammed in her chest as she steadied her breathing, focusing on the crosshairs that hovered over Gavin's torso. She didn't fire, of course. For now, she only watched. After a moment, Gavin reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something white. An envelope? He waved it in the air theatrically. "Evelyn Beauregard," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the stillness of the late afternoon. "We got a letter for you, straight from the top. Why don't you come out and accept it like a good neighbor?" She didn't answer, nor did she move from her perch. She watched him place the envelope on a fence post, pinning it there with a small hunting knife. Then, as a final flourish, he spat on the ground. "We'll be back for an answer," he yelled, his voice tinged with mock courtesy. With that, the bikers revved their engines and peeled away, dust billowing in their wake. Eve waited a solid 5 minutes before venturing outside. She approached the fence post cautiously, wary of a trap or a hidden camera. The envelope was plain, sealed. She pulled the knife out and pocketed it, noting the brand, an expensive model. Inside, the letter was typed neatly. "Mrs. Beauregard, word has it you're considering refusing a most generous offer. I strongly advise you to reconsider before I arrive in person. My associates may have come across as rude, but rest assured their intentions are genuine." We're expanding our operations, and your property is integral to our plans. Denial is not an option you want to explore. I will be in Crescent Gulch within the week. If by then you haven't agreed to terms, we'll proceed by other means. There's no need for this to become personal or violent unless you make it so. Regards, Thorne. As she read Thorne's words, a mix of anger and dread coiled in her stomach. This was more than a petty shakedown. It felt like an all-out siege. She tucked the letter into her pocket, fingers trembling. She knew the next time they showed up, it wouldn't be to drop off a message. They'd come ready for a final negotiation or a final showdown. Turning on her heel, she headed back into the house, mind already racing with the steps she needed to take next. The time for half measures was over. Thorne was coming, and hell was coming with him. News of Thorne's imminent arrival spread like wildfire through Crescent Gulch. By midday, Jacob had wheeled up to Eve's porch, a grim look on his lined face. He held up a dusty manila folder, its edges worn with age. "Service records," he said quietly. "Mine and some folks I keep in touch with from back in the day. I made a few calls last night. There are a couple of old dogs who might be willing to step in if things get real bad." Eve blinked in surprise, then ushered him inside. They laid out the folder on her kitchen table. It contained pictures, discharge papers, and notes scribbled with phone numbers and addresses. She recognized a few of the insignias from decades past: special operations units, reconnaissance squads. Her pulse quickened at the realization that help might be within reach. "But this is Crescent Gulch," she murmured, glancing toward the window as though expecting to see bikers lurking beyond the curtains. "I don't want to drag a bunch of veterans into a turf war. This is my mess." Jacob tapped a photo of a steely-eyed woman wearing a combat helmet. "Trust me, none of these folks are helpless. Some of them wouldn't mind a chance to rattle a few skulls, especially if it means protecting a good person's home. You'd be doing them a favor, giving them a purpose again." He paused, gazing at Eve. "But it's your call. I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in this if you don't want to be." Eve let her eyes drift over the images, the old faces etched with the hardness of experience. A knot formed in her throat. She was torn between wanting to handle this herself, keeping others out of harm's way, and knowing she might be overwhelmed by the Cold Iron Crew's numbers. "Thank you," she finally said, meeting Jacob's eyes. "Give me some time to think about it." They spent the rest of the afternoon refining the ranch's defenses. Eve showed Jacob where she'd placed the makeshift alarms and pointed out areas where an ambush would be most advantageous. The orchard, with its winding rows of pecan trees, offered natural cover. The barn, reinforced with piles of scrap metal, could serve as a fallback position. They plotted out potential sniper nests and angles of fire, a somber exercise that made the ranch feel less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. At one point, while rigging a pulley system to hoist a heavy metal sheet as a barricade, Jacob looked at her with something akin to admiration. "You know your stuff," he commented, wiping sweat from his brow. "This ain't your first rodeo, is it?" Eve paused, considering how much to reveal. A faint smile touched her lips, though it held no humor. "I've seen a fair share of conflicts, enough to know how to defend a position if I need to." She didn't elaborate, and Jacob didn't pry further. They had a silent understanding that each carried scars from battles fought long ago, battles that shaped the people they had become. By sundown, they'd accomplished a remarkable amount, transforming the ranch into a maze of hidden defenses. The day's work left them both exhausted yet oddly resolute. Over a simple supper of canned stew, they discussed the likelihood of Thorne arriving by the end of the week. They theorized how large a force he might bring and what heavy weapons they could have at their disposal. The conversation was grim, but neither flinched from it. They had no illusions about the stakes. Jacob departed soon after, leaving Eve alone once more with her silent ranch. She wandered outside, gazing at the sky ablaze with pink and orange hues. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream of a time when this sunset would signify the end of a peaceful day, free of dread and violence. Then she caught sight of the letter pinned to her refrigerator, Thorne's typed words glaring like a brand. She exhaled slowly, steeling her heart. Peace would have to wait. A storm was coming, and she intended to meet it head-on. On the eve of Thorne's rumored arrival, Crescent Gulch stood on a razor's edge of uncertainty. The local sheriff had been notified by several concerned citizens, but his response was tepid at best. "We'll keep an eye out," was the most he offered, along with a half-hearted promise to drive by the ranch occasionally. For a threat like the Cold Iron crew, that was nothing more than a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Eve spent the day making final checks around her property. She tested the alarm wires, ensured her weapons were cleaned and loaded, and ran through mental drills of what she would do if the bikers attacked from the north, the south, or both. Each scenario ended with the same resolve. She would not run. She would stand her ground. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken dread as night fell. The moon, nearly full, bathed the ranch in a pale glow that set every object in sharp relief. Eve rested on her porch steps, her rifle within arm's reach, listening to the night sounds. An eerie calm settled over the fields, so quiet that even the crickets seemed hesitant to chirp. Her senses were on high alert, every rustle of leaves or distant bark of a coyote magnified in her mind. Around midnight, a single headlight appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as it approached her property. Eve's pulse thudded in her ears. Was this Thorne or one of his scouts? She remained still, every muscle tensed. The motorcycle slowed to a crawl near the gate, the figure aboard barely visible except for the faint reflection of moonlight on chrome. After a long pause, the rider turned around and sped off, leaving only the echo of the engine in the distance. She exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. This was it, the final prelude. Thorne would be here soon, and she doubted he'd come alone. Slipping inside, Eve locked her doors and windows, then headed to the barn. There she opened the trunk one last time, taking out her old tactical vest. It was worn, the camouflage pattern faded, but it still fit snugly over her frame. She inspected the pockets, ensuring each one was stocked with spare magazines, a flashlight, and a small medical kit. The weight of the vest felt like a tangible reminder of the life she'd tried to leave behind. Yet here she was, on the brink of using those skills once more. A tremor of emotion coursed through her, fear, anger, and a resigned acceptance that this confrontation was inevitable. She thought of her husband's face, the promise they made to find peace on this land. She whispered a silent apology to him, wishing she could have shielded their sanctuary from darkness. But now it fell to her to defend it, and defend it she would. Clad in her vest, she stood by the barn door, heart pounding like a war drum. Lightning split the sky, revealing ominous clouds gathering in the distance, as though nature itself sensed the conflict about to unfold. Thunder rumbled, echoing in the wide expanse. With steady hands, Eve loaded her rifle, chambering a round that glinted briefly in the flash of lightning. She allowed herself one last look at the peaceful outlines of her ranch under the moonlight. Then, closing the barn door behind her, she stepped into the night, determined to face whatever dawn might bring, be it hope or bloodshed. Dawn broke with an uneasy hush, as though the entire landscape held its breath for whatever storm Thorne would bring. Eve had barely slept, her tactical vest draped over a kitchen chair, while she nursed a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the wind coaxed the tall grass into a gentle sway, a deceptively peaceful rhythm that masked the anxiety tightening around her heart. She thought she might spot dust plumes on the horizon, signaling a column of motorcycles drawing near. But the roads remained still, etched only with the faint tracks from the night before. This limbo between preparation and assault felt almost worse than a full-on siege. Her mind churned with scenario after scenario. How many men Thorne might bring, whether they'd storm her property in broad daylight or slip in under cover of darkness, and how best to counter each move. Jacob arrived an hour after sunrise, looking more tense than she'd ever seen him. He rolled out of his pickup truck, wheelchair and all, greeting her with a grave nod. "Anything?" he asked, his voice low. Eve shook her head, swallowing against a dry throat. Words felt hollow in the face of so many unknowns. She gestured for Jacob to follow her around the back of the house, where they'd set up a makeshift lookout post. A tall wooden ladder led to a flat portion of the roof, which offered a panoramic view of the surrounding fields. From that vantage, Eve could watch both the main driveway and the back roads. As they climbed, Jacob using a pulley system they'd fashioned for his chair, Eve felt a wave of gratitude that she wasn't entirely alone. She'd worked solo most of her life, trusting few, but Jacob's presence was a tangible reassurance. Once they were both settled, she handed him a pair of binoculars and scanned the horizon with her rifle scope. "We'll spot them before they get too close," she said quietly. more to convince herself than him. "We can call in your old friends if it looks like we're outnumbered." Jacob nodded, his jaw set. "They're on standby, but some of them live hours away. If Thorne decides to show up with a big crew, we might only have ourselves to rely on for the first wave." Eve's stomach knotted at the prospect. Two people, even if one was a highly skilled marksman and the other a seasoned veteran, might not be enough to hold off a gang known for ruthlessness and numbers. But retreat was not an option. This land represented everything she had left of her husband, of the life she tried to carve out. She'd fight for it, no matter the odds. The morning wore on, each passing minute heavy with expectation. Occasionally, a lone car or a truck ambled by on the distant road, causing both Eve and Jacob to tense. But the vehicles passed without slowing, leaving only swirls of dust in their wake. Meanwhile, the Texas heat began to intensify, pressing down on them like a slow, suffocating blanket. They alternated between scanning the terrain and wiping sweat from their brows. By midday, they were still alone. Part of Eve wanted to exhale in relief, but she knew enough about adversaries like Thorne to suspect he might time his move for maximum psychological impact. She fingered the edge of her rifle, keenly aware that they were in a standstill, one that could snap into chaos at any moment. Shortly after noon, a distant murmur reached Eve's ears, carried on the wind like a faint warning. She lifted her head from the scope and exchanged a sharp glance with Jacob. He nodded, confirming he'd heard it too. A faint mechanical drone that could only mean motorcycles in formation. The sound grew louder with each heartbeat, stirring the dust along the main highway in the distance. Eve shifted her rifle's position, honing in on the source through her scope. At first, the riders appeared as small silhouettes cresting a low rise, sunlight glinting off chrome and metal. Then came the thunderous roar, swelling in volume until it hammered at Eve's chest. She counted at least a dozen bikes, but her instincts told her there might be more she couldn't see yet. They slowed near a bend in the highway, bunching up as if conferring among themselves. Even from afar, the group looked menacing, dark shapes arrayed in a loose but purposeful cluster. Jacob positioned the binoculars. "That has to be Thorne," he muttered grimly. "They're too organized to be random passers-by." Eve's pulse quickened. "They'll be here soon then," she said, unable to keep the tremor out of her voice. In a rapid motion, she shimmied down the ladder, trusting Jacob to follow using his rig. They'd planned for this. The moment Thorne's gang was spotted, they'd station themselves at key defensive points around the property. Eve would stay near the barn, which had the best lines of sight for medium-range engagement, while Jacob would position himself along the orchard's edge, where fallen logs and brush provided cover. They'd worked out signals, 2 short blasts on a whistle if someone tried flanking the orchard, 3 if an all-out assault was imminent. Within minutes, they were in place. Eve crouched behind a barrier of corrugated metal and stacked hay bales, rifle at the ready. Her heart thundered, not just from fear but from the grim acceptance that she might soon have to use lethal force. Each second felt like an eternity as the rumble of engines drew nearer. Across the yard, she spotted Jacob maneuvering into position, his rifle propped on a sturdy branch. Even at a distance, she could sense his resolve. Then the bikers appeared, cresting the final hill leading to her ranch. Dust clouded their approach, making it hard to count exact numbers. Eve's mouth went dry when she realized it wasn't just a dozen men. At least 20 riders formed a ragged line along the dirt road, engines snarling with impatience. At the forefront was a figure unlike the others. Larger in build, wearing a distinctive leather vest studded with spikes. His bike sported custom handlebars shaped like horns, giving the impression of a beast leading its pack. They halted at the ranch gate. The lead rider, Shirley Thorne, swung his leg over the seat and stood, surveying the Beauregard property as if sizing up a new acquisition. Without warning, he raised a hand, and the engines cut off, plunging the area into a sudden silence. The hush was even more unsettling than the roar of motors. Eve steadied her breathing, reminding herself of the carefully laid traps, the vantage points, and Jacob's unwavering aim. Seconds ticked by, measured in hammering heartbeats. Thorne's voice finally shattered the hush. "Evelyn Beauregard," he called out, voice resonating with a dark authority that sent a chill down Eve's spine. "I've come for your answer." A short pause followed, then he added with stark finality, "And I don't plan on leaving without it." Eve stayed hidden, letting her silence speak volumes. From her vantage point, she could see Thorne scanning the house, the barn, and the orchard beyond. She kept the crosshairs on his torso but held her finger off the trigger, waiting. One rash shot might trigger an all-out firefight, one she wasn't entirely sure she could win given the overwhelming numbers. Still, letting him continue unchecked was equally dangerous. Her mind raced through possible outcomes. To her left, the tin can tripwire alarm jangled softly, just enough for her to notice. She glanced over, spotting movement near the fence line. One of Thorne's men was attempting to slip around the side of the property, likely to flank the barn. Instinct took over. Eve signaled Jacob with a subtle flash of a hand mirror they'd set up specifically for silent communication. In return, she heard two faint whistles from the orchard, Jacob acknowledging the threat and adjusting his position. Thorne apparently picked up on the movement as well. "Hold it!" he barked at the flanking rider, who froze in place. Then Thorne took a few steps forward, arms raised as though trying to show he wasn't armed. "Mrs. Beauregard, I'd prefer to settle this without bloodshed. You're a practical woman, aren't you? You know we have you outnumbered. There's no need for anyone to get hurt if you just sign over this land or name your price." Eve's chest tightened with both anger and fear. Carefully, she rose from her hiding spot, still keeping a barrier of hay and metal between her and the bikers. "This land isn't for sale," she called back, her voice echoing in the tense air. "I don't care how many of you show up." The group of bikers bristled at her defiance, some of them exchanging looks that suggested they were ready to escalate. Thorne, however, laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that made Eve's skin crawl. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that," he said, eyes roaming the property. "But you also have something we want. This ranch isn't just dirt and weeds. It's a perfect location for our expansion." She tightened her grip on the rifle. "I know what your expansion means," she retorted. "Drugs, guns, terrorizing folks who can't fight back. That doesn't fly here." Thorne's expression darkened. "Fair enough. But here's the thing, Eve. I'm done asking politely. This is your last chance to walk away with something in your pocket. If you don't take it, the only thing you'll leave with is regret." A ripple of tension coursed through the assembled bikers, their postures shifting from intimidation to imminent action. Eve's heart pounded so loudly she could hardly hear anything else. Yet in that dizzying rush of adrenaline, she found clarity. She'd prepared for this. She had her vantage points, her traps, and most importantly, her will to fight. Let Thorne posture all he wanted. If he advanced, she'd show him exactly what a determined widow with nothing left to lose was capable of. She didn't respond to his ultimatum. Instead, she crouched lower, bracing her rifle with steady hands. Every nerve in her body sizzled with anticipation. Thorne lowered his arms, a grim smile twisting his lips. The standoff had begun in earnest, and neither side seemed inclined to back down. Seconds ticked by, stretching into an agonizing standoff. A lone bird called out somewhere in the distance, a dissonant soundtrack to the impending violence. Eve squinted through her rifle scope, noticing Thorne's men shifting into more strategic positions, some taking cover behind their bikes, others edging toward the fence line. The tension in the air was palpable, a tightrope strung between them that could snap at the slightest misstep. It was Thorne who made the first move toward escalation. He jerked his head at one of his lieutenants, a tall, gaunt man with a snake tattoo coiling around his neck. The lieutenant nodded and fired a shot into the air, the crack of the gun echoing across the ranch. Eve's muscles clenched reflexively. They were baiting her, trying to provoke a reaction, maybe even scare her into surrendering. Instead, she took a calming breath, reminding herself of her training. Never fire until you have a clear target and a strategic advantage. Jacob, however, apparently decided the time for caution had passed. A shot rang out from the orchard's edge, striking close to the lieutenant's feet. The man jumped back, cursing as he scrambled behind a cluster of bikes. Thorne's gaze snapped toward where the shot had come from, and he bellowed an order. Eve couldn't make out the words, but the group fanned out in a more organized way, confirming their leader's background in the tactical operations. In a flash, gunfire erupted from multiple angles. Bullets tore through the air, ricocheting off the barn and plowing into hay bales. Eve ducked, pressing herself flat behind her barrier, her heart pounding like a war drum. She carefully returned fire, aiming for the tires of the bikes or the dusty ground near the rider's feet. Her intention wasn't to kill, not yet, but to disrupt and sow confusion. The strategy seemed to work. A couple of bikers scattered, diving for cover. Still, the hail of bullets was intense. One round splintered the wooden post next to her, sending fragments into her cheek. She hissed in pain but held her position, adrenaline pumping through her veins like liquid fire. A particularly loud burst of gunfire made her ears ring, and she realized at least one of Thorne's men wielded an automatic rifle. This was quickly escalating beyond a simple turf threat. It felt like open warfare. Meanwhile, Jacob's vantage point allowed him to pick off any rider foolish enough to venture too far from cover. Through the chaos, Eve could hear his rifle crack at measured intervals, a testament to his steady hand. She risked a glance around the edge of her barricade, spying movement near the orchard. Another biker was attempting to creep along the fence line, likely aiming to flank Jacob. Gritting her teeth, Eve took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The bullet kicked up dirt right by the biker's foot, and he scrambled back in alarm, giving Jacob time to reposition. The gunfight dragged on, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the harsh tang of fear. Thorne remained near the center, barking commands, his presence a dark anchor around which the chaos swirled. Eve realized with a sinking feeling that he and at least a handful of his men were extremely well trained. Their formation and covering maneuvers weren't random. They advanced slowly, methodically, as though her defenses were just another battlefield obstacle they intended to overcome. Despite her best efforts, the wave of aggression was inexorable. If the fight continued at this pace, they'd eventually corner her in the barn or force Jacob into a retreat. She needed a new tactic, and fast. Gritting her teeth, Eve reached for a radio clipped to her vest. It was a short-range walkie-talkie she and Jacob had tested earlier. "Jacob!" she hissed, ducking as another volley of bullets kicked up dust around her. "We need to draw them into the traps. Fall back to the orchard. I'll cover you." She waited for the static to clear, her heart hammering. His voice crackled through. "Copy that. Moving now." Eve emerged from behind her barricade just enough to lay down, suppressing fire at Thorne's men. One bullet pinged off a motorcycle's gas tank, spewing fuel onto the dirt. A second shot grazed a biker's arm, sending him howling in pain. The chaos gave Jacob a brief window to maneuver deeper into the orchard. Thorne, sensing a potential shift, directed some of his men to press forward, while others laid down covering fire of their own. The thunder of engines broke the rhythm of gunfire, and Eve realized a few riders had decided to charge on their bikes, possibly to swarm the property from another angle. Her breath caught in her throat. If they sped around the barn, they might trap her between two fronts. She glanced at the orchard, trusting Jacob to hold his position long enough for her to execute her plan. Now was the time to activate the surprises she and Jacob had set up. She flicked a switch on a small handheld device, an improvised trigger that connected to a series of homemade tripwires. Within seconds, a loud metallic clatter echoed from the far side of the barn. The riders charging in that direction ran smack into a tangle of barbed wire rigged to drop from the rafters. Two of them wiped out, motorcycles skidding in a crash of sparks and twisted metal. Another swerved in time, but ended up stuck in the loose undergrowth, cursing as he tried to free his bike. Seizing the moment, Eve sprinted toward the orchard. Bullets zipped past, one grazing her shoulder and causing her to stumble. Pain flared, white-hot, but she pushed on, adrenaline fueling her retreat. Jacob fired from behind a fallen log, keeping Thorne's men at bay as Eve ducked into the cover of the trees. There, the air smelled of leaves and churned earth, a stark contrast to the dust and petrol scents near the barn. She pressed a hand to her wounded shoulder, grimacing as her fingers came away sticky with blood. It didn't feel life-threatening, but it was enough to sap her strength if this dragged on too long. "I'm here," she whispered into the radio, breath ragged. Jacob responded from a few yards away, hidden behind a trunk thick enough to stop bullets. "You okay?" "Flesh wound," she managed. "We have to funnel them this way. Force them to split up." Already, some of Thorne's men were shouting instructions to regroup. Eve spotted at least one trying to circle around the orchard's perimeter. A quick volley of shots from Jacob dissuaded him, though the orchard's thick canopy limited visibility. Thorne's voice rose above the din, commanding his troops to form a tighter line. By the sound of it, he intended to flush them out of the trees like prey. Eve glanced at Jacob, their eyes meeting in a mutual understanding. They would stand their ground here, in the labyrinth of pecan trees and shadows. The orchard might be their best chance to negate the bikers' numerical advantage, if they used every trick they had left. The orchard was dark and maze-like, with rows of pecan trees planted in neat lines that created natural corridors and choke points. Fallen branches, brush piles, and uneven patches of ground provided both cover and potential hazards. Eve and Jacob had planned for this terrain to be their equalizer, placing hidden tripwires and carefully arranging vantage spots. She crouched low behind a trunk, trying to ignore the throbbing in her shoulder as she scanned for movement through the swirling leaves. Shadows flickered among the trees, some belonging to Thorne's men, others perhaps illusions cast by the dancing sunlight. Gunfire erupted sporadically as the bikers edged in, uncertain of their footing. A few had dismounted to move more quietly, their boots crushing dry twigs and leaves with each step. Eve's ears pricked, tuning in to the smallest sound. Over the radio, Jacob's steady breathing served as a lifeline, reassuring her he was still operational. A sudden burst of automatic fire tore through the orchard, ripping bark off tree trunks and sending shards of wood flying. Eve flattened herself to the ground, biting her lip against a cry of alarm. The orchard's dense canopy shielded them from a direct overhead view, but it also trapped the noise in an echoing cacophony that made it hard to pinpoint exact positions. She rolled behind another tree, cradling her rifle, her finger poised on the trigger. In the distance, she saw two figures creeping parallel to each other. One wore a cut-off vest, revealing sinewy arms inked with menacing tattoos, and carried a large shotgun. The other moved with surprising agility, weaving between the trees with a compact submachine gun at the ready. They seemed to be searching for her and Jacob, coordinating in a flanking maneuver. Eve steadied her breath, counting the seconds as she lined up her shot. Before she could fire, Jacob's rifle cracked. The man with the submachine gun dropped to a knee, clutching his side. The second biker whipped around to return fire, but Eve seized the moment. She squeezed the trigger, her bullet tearing through the orchard air and striking him in the leg. A howl of pain echoed, and both men scrambled for cover behind a thick pecan trunk. Their presence slowed, but they weren't out of the fight yet. Eve's radio crackled. "Nice shot," Jacob murmured, voice taut with concentration. She felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. This was as close to a compliment as they'd give each other in the midst of chaos. The orchard battle raged on, each row of trees becoming its own skirmish. Occasionally, a biker tripped a hidden wire or stumbled into a concealed pit, cursing as they tried to extricate themselves. Eve and Jacob used every advantage the terrain offered, ducking in and out of the shadows, firing short, controlled bursts to keep Thorne's men pinned. Still, the onslaught was relentless. For every biker they neutralized, another seemed to emerge from the darkness of the orchard, determined to corner them. Amid the din, Thorne's voice boomed again, closer this time. "Eve, you're only making this harder on yourself," he roared. "My men are better trained than you think. Give up now, and maybe I'll spare the rest of this sad little town." Eve's eyes narrowed. She pressed the radio button lightly. "Jacob," she whispered, "I see a clearing ahead. If we can draw Thorne out, we might be able to isolate him." Thorne was the linchpin. If they took him down, the morale of the Cold Iron crew could shatter. She prayed it wasn't just wishful thinking, because the longer this fight lasted, the slimmer their chances of victory became. Jacob's reply came swiftly through the radio. "We isolate Thorne. We stand a chance. But watch your flank. These guys are no amateurs." Eve nodded to herself, swallowing hard. Blood still seeped through her makeshift bandage, each pulse a reminder that she was far from invincible. Ignoring the pain, she inched forward, careful not to crush any twigs that might give away her position. The orchard had grown into a war zone, the thick canopy muting the afternoon sun into dappled patches of light that streaked across the ground. Every so often, she heard the rustle of leaves or the muffled swearing of a wounded biker. She maneuvered toward the clearing, a small open space in the heart of the orchard, usually reserved for gatherings when harvest season rolled around. Tables and chairs were stacked under a makeshift pavilion, now riddled with bullet holes. The place offered little natural cover, but it was ringed by enough trees to stage an ambush if needed. Jacob, moving along a parallel row, occasionally fired shots to keep Thorne's men occupied. This tactic aimed to funnel them toward the clearing, forcing them into a more predictable route. The distinct sound of Thorne's gravelly voice echoed again, though Eve couldn't make out his words. Each syllable carried an edge of anger and frustration. Good, she thought. Frustrated enemies made mistakes. She arrived at the clearing's edge first, pressing her back against a thick trunk. Her rifle felt heavier than before, exhaustion seeping into her limbs. The orchard floor was littered with fallen pecans and broken branches, some coated in a fine layer of dust kicked up by the firefight. The smell of gunpowder clung to the air, mingling with the orchard's usual earthy aroma. Eve strained her ears, waiting for any sign of Thorne's approach. Her patience was rewarded. Thorne himself emerged from between two rows of trees, flanked by two of his men. Even from a distance, his imposing frame and spiked vest were unmistakable. He held a large caliber pistol in one hand, scanning the area with cold, calculating eyes. He didn't look panicked or rushed. He looked like a predator on the hunt. Eve signaled quietly to Jacob by clicking the radio button twice in quick succession. She watched as Thorne gestured to his men, indicating they should spread out. The clearing lay directly ahead of them. If she played her cards right, she could force Thorne to separate from his entourage, maybe lure them into one of the orchard's dead-end rows. Holding her breath, Eve stepped out from cover and fired a shot intentionally wide, just enough to alert Thorne to her position without hitting him. The bullet splintered a wooden beam on the pavilion, drawing Thorne's attention instantly. He barked an order, and his men ducked behind trees, returning fire sporadically. Thorne pressed forward, firing at the trunk that Eve used for cover. Splinters rained down, but she managed to dodge away in time. She led him deeper into the clearing, weaving behind stacked chairs and tables, each bullet whizzing past like a lethal wasp. If Thorne followed, she'd have a clear shot. Jacob would take care of the goons. She just needed Thorne to overcommit. Heart pounding, she ducked behind a metal barrel, poking her rifle over the rim to keep him pinned. Thorne snarled, "You should have taken my offer. Too late for deals now." Eve grimaced, her grip on the rifle slick with sweat. "That's what you think," she muttered under her breath, praying Jacob was in position. Any moment now, and the crucial part of her plan would spring. But in a battlefield riddled with unpredictability, even the best-laid plans could crumble in a single misstep. A sudden commotion rippled through the orchard behind Thorne. Jacob had unleashed one of the final booby traps. A net rigged high in the branches, weighted with scrap metal. With a well-aimed pull of a rope, the contraption came crashing down. Thorne's two henchmen yelled in alarm, diving aside to avoid the falling debris. One of them got caught at the edge of the net, tangling in heavy chains that clanked and twisted around his arms. The other scrambled away, inadvertently firing a flurry of bullets into the net, which only made the mess more chaotic. Thorne spun around, momentarily caught off guard by the clamor. Eve seized the opportunity, popping out from behind the barrel to aim a clean shot. Her finger tightened on the trigger, heart pounding in her ears. At the last second, Thorne sidestepped with uncanny reflexes, and her bullet grazed his vest, sparking off a metal spike. He locked eyes with her, a snarl twisting his lips. Rage radiated from him like heat off asphalt. "Slick move, but not good enough," he roared, firing in her direction. Eve dove, rolling behind a low stack of crates, feeling the wind of the bullet passing dangerously close to her head. She landed hard on her injured shoulder, a searing pain lancing through her. Gasping, she forced herself to push on, blood soaking her bandage. Jacob emerged from the shadows, rifle aimed at Thorne. He squeezed off a shot, but Thorne dropped to one knee, returning fire. Jacob's wheelchair made a tempting target, and Thorne wasted no time focusing on it. Bullets pinged off the metal frame, forcing Jacob to jerk backward to avoid being riddled with holes. A flash of frustration crossed Jacob's face as he tried to maneuver for another angle. Eve couldn't let Thorne zero in on Jacob. Ignoring her throbbing shoulder, she pulled the pin on a smoke grenade, a relic from her old life that she hoped still worked. Lobbing it toward Thorne, she closed her eyes as it exploded in a billowing cloud of grayish smoke. The orchard clearing filled with a choking haze, obscuring visibility. Thorne coughed and backed away, temporarily disoriented. That was the window they needed. Jacob used the cover to wheel himself behind a sturdy trunk, reloading his rifle with trembling fingers. Eve crawled toward another vantage spot, her shoulder screaming in protest. Through the smoke, she could see Thorne's silhouette, looming tall and furious. The net trap still pinned one of his men, while the other struggled to join Thorne without tripping over the orchard's maze of roots and brush. Suddenly, Thorne's voice cut through the smoke. I've had enough of these tricks, Beauregard. Show yourself. The sincerity of his anger was almost palpable. Even half-blind, he radiated the menace of a predator refusing to yield. Eve's mind raced. This was the moment to press the advantage. But she also knew that Thorne would be most dangerous when cornered. Steeling herself, she took aim through the swirling haze, heart beating a frantic tattoo. She glimpsed movement at the periphery of her vision, Jacob repositioning for a clean shot. Thorne fired wildly into the smoke, each muzzle flash illuminating his face twisted in fury. Eve steadied her breathing. In warfare, composure was currency, and she intended to spend it wisely. If they could coordinate just one more clear shot, Thorne would fall. But that was a very big if. Thorne, hacking from the smoke, staggered closer to the center of the clearing. Eve tracked him carefully, waiting for the last wisps of gray to drift away, each second an agonizing wait. She could see the tension in his posture, a readiness to spring into lethal action at the slightest provocation. At the same time, she heard the labored grunts of his henchmen, still trapped under the fallen net, and the frantic movements of the other who hadn't managed to regroup. Jacob, still hidden, silently indicated his position with a subtle wave of the hand mirror. Eve signaled back that Thorne was almost in her line of fire. They'd only have one shot at this. Thorne's reflexes were too sharp for a second chance. Then as the smoke thinned, Thorne became fully visible. He spotted Eve's silhouette against the trees and raised his pistol. Instinct screamed for her to fire first. She squeezed the trigger, but Thorne ducked and rolled to the side, returning a barrage of shots that splintered wood above her head. Eve dove to the ground, feeling the shock wave of bullets thudding into the earth an arm's length away. Before Thorne could correct his aim, Jacob fired from his hidden angle. The shot grazed Thorne's leg, drawing blood. Thorne roared in pain and anger, stumbling but refusing to go down. Instead, he pivoted, training his pistol on Jacob's position. Eve's heart lurched. Jacob was a bigger target, less mobile in the orchard's uneven terrain. No time to think. Eve braced her rifle and fired at Thorne's weapon hand. The recoil jarred her injured shoulder, but her aim held steady enough. The bullet struck Thorne's forearm, forcing him to drop his pistol with a guttural snarl. Seizing the opportunity, Jacob fired again, this time aiming for Thorne's torso. His shot landed, and Thorne staggered backward, vest spikes scraping against tree bark as he crashed into a trunk. A hacking cough escaped him, blood flecking his lips. For a moment, Thorne glared at Eve, disbelief and hatred mingling in his eyes. Then with a defiant grimace, he sank to the ground. The orchard fell silent except for the ragged breathing of the wounded and the faint crackle of distant gunfire where scattered bikers still fought. Eve's vision swam, exhaustion threatening to collapse her. She forced herself upright, rifle trained on Thorne. "Stay down," she rasped, her tone edged with what little authority she could muster. Thorne tried to lift his arm but found it unresponsive, torn by bullets. He managed a sneer, half pained, half challenging. "You think this ends with me?" he spat, voice trembling. "My crew. They'll level this place." Jacob maneuvered closer, rifle at the ready. The orchard's sun-dappled light revealed a deep cut across his temple, blood trickling down to his jaw. "Your crew is scattered," he said flatly. "We've taken down enough of them to send the rest running. And if any remain, well, we're not done fighting." Eve swallowed, adrenaline surging in one final wave. She glanced around, confirming that Thorne's men were either incapacitated or had fled deeper into the orchard. The netted henchman lay groaning in pain, while the other was nowhere to be seen, possibly retreated when Thorne fell. Her voice quivered, but she forced it out. "It's over." A twisted grin creased Thorne's features, even as he wheezed. "You've just made yourself a lot of enemies, Beauregard." With a final glare, his head slumped to the side, consciousness slipping away. Eve stood there, heart pounding, scarcely believing they'd neutralized the Cold Iron Crew's leader. But victory tasted bitter. There were bodies on her land, the orchard was shredded by gunfire, and the quiet life she'd once known was irrevocably shattered. In the aftermath of Thorne's collapse, the orchard felt eerily still, as though it were holding its breath to see what might happen next. Jacob and Eve exchanged exhausted looks. Neither had the energy for words. Their ears still rang with the echoes of gunfire, and the stench of cordite hung in the humid air. Slowly, carefully, Eve took stock of the situation. Thorne lay bleeding against a tree, unconscious but breathing. His trapped henchmen groaned beneath the net, while the orchard remained dotted with wounded or scattered bikers. One or two could still be out there, prowling among the pecan trees, but their momentum had broken. Eve winced as she applied pressure to her bleeding shoulder. Every muscle in her body ached, and she felt dangerously close to collapsing. Jacob wheeled closer, his own injuries evident. "We should secure Thorne," he said, voice tight. "Make sure he doesn't slip away. Then we'll call for help, real help." Eve nodded, but her mind spun with questions. Would the local sheriff even be able to handle the fallout? The Cold Iron crew might have left a swath of destruction across the county. And what if some of Thorne's men regrouped to launch a counterattack? Despite her exhaustion, she forced herself into action. She found a length of rope in a storage shed near the orchard, returning to bind Thorne's arms and legs. He stirred faintly, but his injuries kept him from resisting. Jacob, ever pragmatic, retrieved whatever weapons he could find among the fallen bikers, pistols, knives, and even the submachine gun from the man they'd wounded earlier. Most of the gang members who were able had fled once Thorne dropped. A few lay moaning on the ground, clutching their wounds, no longer a threat but in dire need of medical attention. Jacob piled their confiscated weapons in a central spot. "We'll let the authorities sort this out," he muttered, anger and exhaustion in his eyes. Eve took a shaky breath, stepping away from Thorne to assess the broader damage. The orchard was peppered with bullet holes. Branches had been snapped off, leaves scattered everywhere. Smoke curled in thin tendrils where someone's discarded cigarette had set a patch of dry brush smoldering. She stomped it out, her boots grinding into the dirt. The once peaceful grove of pecan trees bore the scars of a battle that felt both triumphant and tragic. With Jacob's help, she made her way back to the house. The path seemed longer than before, every step a test of her waning strength. They paused at the barn, where two of the bikers had crashed earlier. One was gone, apparently having limped off. The other lay unconscious beside his ruined motorcycle. "We'll have to radio the sheriff," Eve said softly, glancing at Jacob. "And maybe those friends of yours, too. This is bigger than us now." Jacob pursed his lips. "I'll call them in. And the sheriff, though I doubt he'll know what to do with a war zone on a ranch." Eve managed a weary chuckle. "Then he'd better learn fast." Behind them, the sun dipped lower in the sky, staining the horizon with hues of orange and purple. What should have been a peaceful evening turning in was now a scene from a small-scale war. Their defenses had held, for the moment, but the cost was high, and the threat wasn't entirely extinguished. Thorne's dire warning lingered in Eve's thoughts. She had made enemies, dangerous ones. But as she rested against the barn's splintered wall, feeling Jacob's steady presence by her side, a grim satisfaction settled in. The Cold Iron crew had underestimated her, pegged her as an easy mark. They'd learned the hard way that underestimating Evelyn Beauregard was a mistake that could cost them dearly. And while the road ahead promised more challenges, she was no longer the solitary widow who flinched at every rumor. She was a fighter, worn, bloodied, but unbroken. The sun sank behind the Texan horizon, painting the sky in dusky lavender and pale gold as the aftermath of the battle settled like a heavy fog over the ranch. Eve stood on her battered porch, trying to piece together the reality of what had just transpired. Her shoulder pulsed with pain, a rhythmic reminder that this was no nightmare. Bloodstains, hers and others, smudged the porch steps, and spent shell casings littered the yard. The tang of gunpowder still clung to the air, an acrid echo of the firefight that had erupted like a storm and then subsided just as swiftly. Jacob busied himself gathering the wounded in one area, while a few shaken townspeople who had ventured to the ranch after hearing the commotion hovered nervously in the background. They whispered among themselves, eyes darting to the unconscious Thorne, still bound and bleeding in the orchard. The same question lingered on everyone's lips. What now? Eve's own thoughts wrestled with that query. She felt a current of exhaustion tugging at her limbs, urging her to sit, to sleep, to forget the violence she'd just engaged in. But the world refused to slow down. In the distance, sirens wailed, a rarity in Crescent Gulch. No doubt the sheriff and maybe an ambulance were on their way, spurred into action by frantic phone calls from townspeople who'd heard gunshots. A battered pickup truck rumbled into the driveway. Out stepped two of Jacob's contacts, older men with hard-set jaws and faded military tattoos. They had come from a nearby county, apparently spurred by Jacob's urgent messages. One introduced himself as Marcus, the other as Ruiz. Each carried themselves with the grim composure of someone who'd seen combat more than once. Without a word, they began helping Jacob move the wounded bikers onto tarps, separating the unconscious from those who might still pose a threat. Amid the chaotic swirl of activity, Eve found herself confronted by Margie, the diner owner, and a few other townsfolk. Their eyes brimmed with questions, confusion, and even a hint of awe. Margie's voice shook as she asked, "Eve, what in the world happened here? Are you all right?" Eve hesitated. For years, she'd been a woman of few words, content to let Crescent Gulch believe she was nothing more than a reclusive widow. Explaining the truth now felt monumental, like lifting a boulder off her chest. Yet before she could formulate a response, the sheriff's cruiser skidded to a stop at the edge of the property, its lights strobing crimson and blue against the darkening sky. Relief mixed with dread. The authorities were here, but could they really handle this mess? Eve glanced around at the shattered windows of her barn, the battered orchard beyond, and Thorne's men who still roamed at large, potentially regrouping somewhere out there in the twilight. She swallowed hard, forcing her shoulders to square. She might have beaten Thorne, but the fight for her ranch and the safety of Crescent Gulch was far from over. Perhaps it had only just begun. Sheriff Alan Tully stepped out of his cruiser, boots crunching on gravel that was still dusted with fragments of bullet casings. He was a tall, lanky man with a sun-baked face and eyes that betrayed weariness. Typically, his duties in Crescent Gulch revolved around petty theft or disputes over wandering livestock. This scale of violence, a near war on someone's ranch, was unprecedented in his tenure. He surveyed the scene, jaw tightening as he took in the toppled motorcycles, wounded bikers, and armed townsfolk. "What in tarnation?" he muttered, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. Margie tried to explain, voice trembling, but Jacob cut in with a brisk summary of events. The threats, the arrival of Thorne's gang, and the ensuing firefight that nearly tore the ranch apart. Sheriff Tully's face turned grim, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "Eve," he said slowly, turning to her, "you're telling me you and Jacob here, along with a few townspeople, fought off an entire biker gang on your own?" Eve nodded, wincing at the throb in her shoulder. "They came to take my land. Thorne, the man over there, led them." Tully flicked his gaze toward Thorne's unconscious form, noting the ropes binding him. "And you took him down," he said, half in awe, half in apprehension. "Well, I'd say that's cause for some explaining. I see a lot of guns around here, a lot of wounded. This is bigger than just you and me. The state police are gonna want a piece of this." A hush settled over the group. It was one thing to call the local sheriff, another entirely to bring in state or even federal authorities. Eve felt a mix of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, outside help could deter any immediate retaliation from Thorne's crew. On the other, too much scrutiny might dredge up her past, a past she had painstakingly buried. In the background, Marcus and Ruiz busied themselves applying makeshift first aid to the injured bikers who were no longer a threat. One of them, his face smeared with dirt and blood, groaned that he couldn't feel his legs. Marcus administered what help he could, grim-faced, while Ruiz kept an alert eye on the tree line. Sheriff Tully noticed the men's practiced efficiency and narrowed his eyes. "Friends of yours?" he asked Jacob. Jacob grunted in affirmation. "They're veterans like me. When I told them about our little predicament, they drove out to help." Tully let out a long breath, glancing at the heavily armed, battle-hardened pair. "I see. Well, your predicament is about to become a statewide operation. We'll need paramedics, and I'll have to file a report that's likely to land on some bigwig's desk in Austin." Eve mustered a nod. Every breath felt heavy, as though the weight of the entire ranch pressed upon her lungs. The sheriff was right. This was only the beginning of the fallout. "You do what you need to do, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Just remember, this gang threatened to take over an entire region, not just my ranch. We need protection, or they'll be back. Tully replaced his hat, lips pressed into a thin line. Then let's hope we're ready when they come. Night descended fully while the ranch bustled with activity, reminiscent of a disaster zone. Ambulances arrived in a convoy of flashing lights, their sirens piercing the hushed lull. Paramedics hurried from one wounded individual to another. Some bikers groaned in pain, cursing their leaders between gasps for air. Others lay silent, too gravely injured or too frightened to speak. A few uniformed deputies fanned out, combing the property with flashlights to ensure no fugitives were hiding in the darkness. Eve stood near the barn, watching with a strange detachment as a paramedic cleaned and dressed the bullet wound in her shoulder. The sting of antiseptic made her grit her teeth, but her mind churned with bigger worries. Where was the rest of Thorne's crew now? Would they regroup and strike again? And how would the town react once the full scope of her background came to light? She half expected the paramedic to question her about the array of weapons she'd kept hidden or the trap-laden orchard. Instead, he worked silently, focused on patching her up. Once finished, he offered a curt nod. You'll need proper medical attention, stitches, maybe more. But for now, you should be all right. Jacob rolled up, fresh bandages around his head, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. Heard the sheriff put Thorne under guard in one of the ambulances. They're taking him to the county hospital, but they'll have state troopers waiting. Eve exhaled, relief mingling with dread. We've bought ourselves some time, but this isn't over. Thorne's people will want revenge, especially if he's locked up. Gangs like this, they don't just fold when their leader goes down. Jacob's gaze hardened. We'll do what we must, but maybe we'll get some backup this time. Once word spreads about what happened, law enforcement higher up might realize these bikers are a menace worth dealing with seriously. She glanced out at the orchard, where she could still see the faint glow of flashlights flickering through the rows of pecan trees. The land bore brutal scars, felled branches, bullet-ridden trunks, and the lingering smell of smoke. A pang of loss squeezed her heart. This ranch was more than a piece of property. It was her home, her promise to her late husband. Now it felt violated, fragile. Yet amid the wreckage, townspeople had gathered. Some approached with blankets or cups of hot coffee, offering comfort. Margie and a couple of others from the diner passed around sandwiches to the exhausted defenders. Their eyes were wide as though they'd woken up from a long sleep, realizing how vulnerable their quiet town truly was. A hand touched Eve's arm. It was Travis, the teenage gas station attendant, trembling from head to toe. Never seen anything like this, he whispered. You saved us, Mrs. Beauregard. She shook her head. Saved myself. You all got caught in the crossfire. But Travis didn't seem convinced. He pressed his lips together, then nodded solemnly before stepping away. Eve closed her eyes, letting the night air fill her lungs, heavy with the odor of gunpowder and uncertainty. The battles might be done for the evening, but the war was far from won. By the time dawn streaked the sky with pale oranges and yellows, the immediate crisis had subsided into a grim sort of lull. The ambulances had departed, ferrying the most seriously wounded to the nearest hospital. Sheriff Tully and his deputies were still on the property, taking statements and cataloging evidence. Shell casings, smashed motorcycles, makeshift booby traps. It would be a lengthy investigation, one certain to attract statewide, if not national, attention. Jacob, Marcus, and Ruiz had camped out in the barn, keeping a vigilant watch through the night. Whenever Eve woke from her fitful dozing, she spotted them conferring in low voices, exchanging theories about how the Cold Iron crew might retaliate. They talked about reinforcing the ranch's defenses, possibly even setting up a rotating guard. Eve couldn't deny that her orchard, once her sanctuary, now resembled a militarized zone. At first light, the orchard drew her like a magnet. She walked gingerly among the trees, tracing the bullet holes in the bark with trembling fingers. It felt like vandalism of something sacred. She thought back to the early days, when she and her husband had planted some of these saplings, daydreaming about a future filled with quiet routines and seasonal harvests. Now the orchard's battered state mirrored her own emotional wounds. Jacob rolled up beside her, the morning sun highlighting the faint lines of worry etched into his face. You all right? He asked, voice hushed. She sighed, pushing a strand of hair from her face. No, but I'll mend. The orchard, though, it might never be the same. They paused at a spot where Thorne had fallen. The grass was still flattened, stained with dark patches. Jacob leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think they'll come back?" His tone was more subdued than before, reflective. Eve looked toward the horizon, the sky blushing gold. "I'd bet on it," she said. "Gangs like the Cold Iron Crew don't just dissolve because their leader was taken. There's always someone willing to step up, reclaim territory, especially if money's involved. Drugs, guns, whatever." Jacob nodded grimly. "I'll ask Marcus and Ruiz to stay a bit. Their presence might deter an immediate strike." Gratitude swelled in her chest. She wasn't used to relying on others, but the scale of the threat dwarfed her solitary defenses. "Thanks. And about the orchard, the ranch. If all this attention stirs up my past," he cut her off with a raised hand. "Your secrets are your own. If the law starts prying, we'll handle it. Fact is, you saved this town from a far worse fate, and folks know it now." Eve's throat tightened. Saving the town was never her primary mission. She just wanted to protect her home. But she realized Crescent Gulch was part of that home too, in its quiet, unassuming way. Exhaling softly, she brushed her fingertips over the ragged bark of a pecan tree. "Then I guess we'll handle it," she murmured. They lingered in the orchard for a few more moments, letting the morning sun warm away some of the chill left by the previous day's violence. Despite everything, the land still held a kind of battered beauty, an enduring symbol of resilience. If Eve had anything to say about it, it would continue to stand, come what may. Over the next few days, Crescent Gulch found itself the unlikely center of a media storm. News vans rolled into town, blocking the dusty roads and setting up satellite dishes in front of the diner. Reporters in crisp suits interviewed Sheriff Tully, townspeople, and whoever else would speak on camera. The headlines practically wrote themselves. "Small-town widow fends off infamous biker gang." Eve's name featured prominently in every broadcast, each journalist scrambling to uncover any tantalizing detail of her background. Eve did her best to avoid the spotlight, but that proved nearly impossible. Camera crews sought her out at the hardware store, the feed shop, even outside her ranch gates, where she'd started repairing the fences with Jacob. Mick in hand, they peppered her with questions. How did she learn to fight? Where had she served in the military? Was she worried about retaliation? She met most inquiries with terse, non-committal answers. "I did what I had to," she repeated over and over, like a mantra. Jacob backed her up, deflecting the more probing questions. Yet with each passing day, the swirl of curiosity around her only grew. Rumors multiplied. She was a former CIA operative, a fugitive vigilante, the last surviving member of a legendary special forces unit. It was both absurd and unnerving. Meanwhile, the legal machinery ground on. Thorne was in critical condition at a county hospital under round-the-clock guard. Several of his men had been arrested, some after surgeries to remove bullets. A handful remained at large, presumably having fled once they realized their leader was down. The state police set up a task force to monitor the gang's movements across multiple counties. Yet these efforts did little to quell the underlying unease that rippled through Crescent Gulch. Margie, ever the town's social glue, tried to bring a sense of normalcy back. She reopened her diner after a 2-day closure, serving steaming plates of eggs and bacon to anxious farmers and curious reporters alike. The barber shop resumed its routine, though the old men who usually exchanged lighthearted gossip now spoke in hushed tones about potential retribution. Children were kept under closer watch, their parents fearful of men on roaring motorcycles appearing without warning. Jacob's friends, Marcus and Ruiz, remained on the ranch, taking turns patrolling the perimeter at night. Eve appreciated their presence, though it felt surreal, like she was living in a war camp rather than the peaceful farmstead she'd cherished for so long. She threw herself into work during the day, making repairs, feeding her animals, and trying to ignore the stares of onlookers who sometimes gathered at her fence line, hoping for a glimpse of the ranch widow warrior. One afternoon, as she hammered a loose fence post, a local reporter she vaguely recognized approached. "Mrs. Beauregard, do you have any comment on the latest statement from the Cold Iron Crew's representatives?" he asked, voice edged with urgency. "They claim Thorne acted alone, without the club's official sanction, and that the rest of the gang aims to distance themselves from his violence." Eve paused, resting her forehead against the cool metal of the post. Of course, they tried to disown Thorne. It was the most strategic move. But that didn't mean they wouldn't come for revenge. She lifted her head, meeting the reporter's gaze. "I have no comment," she said quietly, then turned back to her work, driving the nail home with a final, decisive strike. While the media frenzy raged and the town braced for potential fallout, Eve found moments of solace in the orchard's slow regeneration. She worked tirelessly among the pecan trees, pruning away damaged branches and clearing debris. Nature, it seemed, had no agenda but to continue growing, pushing out fresh leaves where bullets had torn through bark. Each new sprout was a testament to resilience, a silent lesson she tried to take to heart. Occasionally, she'd catch Jacob watching her from a distance, concern etched into his features. Though his head wound was healing, his spirit carried the burden of weariness. He'd confided in her that he hadn't slept well since the firefight, haunted by memories not just of this battle, but of older, darker ones he'd hoped to leave behind. She understood the weight of that insomnia, the endless cycle of adrenaline and regret. The orchard became their place of unspoken therapy. Marcus and Ruiz often joined them, offering practical help, reinforcing a damaged trunk here, setting up a rudimentary irrigation system there. But it was more than manual labor. In the quiet rustle of leaves, the four of them found a brief reprieve from the tension that clung to the outside world. Sometimes they talked in low voices about old service days, the camaraderie of comrades and the cruelty of war. Other times they worked in silence, letting the orchard's gentle hush soothe their battered nerves. News from Thorne's hospital bed filtered in sporadically. He was stable, but not yet fit to stand trial. His lieutenants faced arraignment, and rumors swirled that the higher echelons of the Cold Iron crew were scrambling to either distance themselves from Thorne's failures or quietly mobilize for retaliation. The unpredictability gnawed at everyone. Sheriff Tully tried to maintain a visible presence, stationing patrol cars on the outskirts of Crescent Gulch. But the roads were wide and the land expansive. No one could guarantee the Cold Iron crew wouldn't strike at an opportune moment. One late afternoon, while Eve was trimming deadwood off a damaged tree, Jacob approached her with a solemn expression. "We got word from the state troopers," he said. "There's intel suggesting a small splinter group of the crew might be making its way toward the county line. Something about unfinished business." Eve's hands tightened on the pruning shears. "How reliable is this intel?" He sighed. "Hard to say, but the troopers want us to stay alert. They might try to station an officer nearby, but you know how short-staffed they are." She nodded, feeling the old tension coil in her stomach. "Then we stay vigilant," she replied softly, glancing around at the orchard's battered serenity. The idea of another firefight on this land, so soon after the last, made her heart twist with dread. But she wouldn't run. She had chosen this place, fought for it, and she'd do so again if she had to. Jacob offered a reassuring clap on her uninjured shoulder. They stood there for a moment, the warm breeze rustling the leaves overhead. No words were needed. Both understood the fragile piece they'd carved out might be shattered at any moment, and both were willing to defend it until their last breath. The days stretched into a week, then two, with no fresh attack on the ranch. Each sunrise arrived like a cautious gift, one more day without gunfire. Yet no one mistook the lull for genuine safety. Eve continued her orchard repairs, often assisted by Marcus, Ruiz, or Jacob. Their presence was reassuring. They were a small but formidable team, bound by necessity and growing friendship. When the state troopers finally made good on their promise to station an officer nearby, it was a woman named Officer Helena Rodriguez. She set up a small trailer on a vacant lot about a mile from Eve's ranch, using it as a mobile command post. Helena was sharp-eyed and polite, but her mere presence underscored the precariousness of the situation. Eve couldn't recall a time when Crescent Gulch needed a permanent police presence, let alone one specifically for fear of violent retaliation. Helena visited the ranch one afternoon to introduce herself. "I'll be patrolling the local roads," she explained, standing near Eve's front porch. "Just so you know, we have a radio channel set up. If you see anything suspicious, anything at all, call it in." Eve studied the officer's earnest expression, noting the tension lines around her mouth. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But are you here alone?" Helena nodded. "For now, yes. We're spread thin, And the powers that be don't think we can justify more resources for just one small town. But they're wrong. I know how dangerous these biker gangs can be. Rest assured, I won't let you face them alone if they come around again. Eve appreciated the determination in her voice. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Crescent Gulch was on the edge of something big, something the town was ill-equipped to handle. Understood, she replied, forcing a tight smile. She handed the officer her walkie-talkie frequency, the same one she shared with Jacob, Marcus, and Ruiz, in case an emergency required immediate coordination. That evening, a palpable tension rippled through the community. Patrons at Margie's Diner spoke in hushed tones, eyes flicking to the windows every time a motorcycle engine rumbled in the distance. Some farmers began locking up their equipment at night, unheard of in a place where everyone knew everyone else. Even the local pastor inserted a subtle note about vigilance and unity into his Sunday sermon, cautioning the congregation that evil could infiltrate even the most peaceful hamlet. Eve, for her part, found herself grappling with unexpected guilt. She'd come here years ago to escape her violent past. Now it seemed she'd inadvertently drawn violence to Crescent Gulch. Logically, she knew Thorne had targeted the ranch for its strategic location, not because of her personal history, but the pain in her shoulder and the bullet holes in her orchard reminded her that she'd effectively reignited a conflict that the town was now forced to share. One star-studded night, as she stood on her porch with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, she whispered an apology to the silent fields, an apology to her husband, whose dream of a tranquil homestead lay in tatters, and an apology to the townspeople who'd been dragged into a fight they never asked for. The only consolation was the thought that if she hadn't stood up to Thorne, the Cold Iron crew might have waltzed in unchecked, wreaking even greater havoc. That alone justified her stand, but it didn't lighten her heart. 2 nights later, the threat they had all been dreading arrived. It was past midnight when Eve heard the low rumble of motorcycles echo across the fields. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness of her bedroom, heart immediately pounding. A quick glance at the clock confirmed it was 12:47 a.m. She threw off the covers, adrenaline surging as she reached for the walkie-talkie on her nightstand. "Jacob, you hear that?" she whispered, voice shaking off the vestiges of sleep. His response crackled through almost instantly. "Yeah, Marcus and Ruiz are already moving to position. Helena's on the line. She says multiple bikes heading east from the county road." Eve breathed out, forcing herself to stay calm. If the Cold Iron crew was making a move, it would likely be a smaller splinter group, less organized than Thorne's main force, but still dangerous enough. She pulled on a pair of pants and a sturdy jacket, ignoring the protests from her still healing shoulder. Grabbing her rifle from the locked cabinet, she hurried onto the porch. The moon was high, casting silver light across the ranch. The orchard loomed like a dark, hulking silhouette. She remembered all too well how gunfire had once split that quiet gloom. Jacob's shape emerged from the barn, rolling carefully across the uneven ground. Marcus and Ruiz took up positions near the perimeter fence, their figures bristling with gear. Through the walkie-talkie, Officer Helena's voice came, laced with tension. "I'm trailing them. 4 bikes, maybe 5. They're doing about 30 miles an hour, real slow, like they're scoping things out." Eve nodded, though no one could see her. "Understood," she murmured. "We'll try to funnel them if they come up the driveway. Stay safe out there." Moments stretched like taut wire. The roar of engines grew louder, then receded, then roared again, as though the riders were circling the vicinity. Each time it intensified, Eve's pulse hammered in her throat. Jacob positioned himself behind a barricade of hay bales near the barn, scanning the darkness through a scope. Marcus, hidden in the orchard's shadows, signaled readiness with a single flick of his flashlight. Then from the far side of the property, headlights sliced through the night. 4 motorcycles glided toward the ranch gate, their riders silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Eve raised her rifle, every sense on high alert. She wanted to call out, demand they leave, but her instincts warned her that any talk might be futile. This group hadn't come for negotiation. A single shot cracked the stillness. One of the riders fired into the air, a warning or a challenge. Eve's mind flashed back to Thorne's lieutenant doing the same thing, history repeating itself in a twisted loop. Her stomach clenched. She refused to watch her land become a battleground again. She keyed the walkie-talkie, voice firm. This is private property. Turn around now, or we will defend ourselves. The ultimatum echoed into the night, brimming with the promise of violence if ignored. The riders revved their engines in response, a collective snarl that reverberated through the darkness. It was time then. Eve steadied her weapon, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had survived one assault. She could survive another. With a final glance at Jacob, who nodded resolutely, she prepared to face the second wave of menacing outlaws determined to test just how far a quiet widow would go to protect what was hers. Gunfire erupted in staccato bursts, sharper than any thunder. One of the riders peeled off to circle the property, while the others charged straight toward the gate. Jacob's rifle answered with a resounding crack, forcing the lead bike to swerve wildly. The rider cursed and steadied himself, narrowly avoiding a collision with the fence. Meanwhile, Marcus and Ruiz unleashed covering fire from the orchard, the muzzle flashes illuminating the pecan trees in brief, blinding flares. Eve joined in, aiming to disable rather than kill. She fired at the front tire of the next bike. Sparks flew as the bullet ricocheted off metal, and the motorcycle skidded, throwing its rider onto the hard-packed dirt. A yelp of pain cut through the air. Another outlaw returned fire, spraying a hail of bullets that pinged off the barn's exterior. One found its mark in Eve's direction. She ducked behind a wooden post just in time, splinters slicing across her cheek. Officer Helena's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. "I'm en route. Keep your positions. I'll block them from the roadside." Eve gripped the radio, her breath ragged. "We're holding. Just hurry." Over the orchard, she saw muzzle flashes as Marcus and Ruiz engaged the flank. The distant rumble of another bike suggested at least one more circling wide, looking for an unguarded entry. Adrenaline spiked in her veins. They couldn't allow themselves to be surrounded. Jacob fired again, this time hitting the ground near a rider's wheel. The man panicked, swerving into a ditch. His bike toppled with a crash, the rider scrambling free in time to avoid being pinned. In the moonlight, Eve caught sight of patches on his jacket, different from Thorne's Iron Horse emblem. Perhaps this was a rival faction allied with the Cold Iron crew, or a new subgroup trying to make a name. The details didn't matter. Their intent was clear. 3 bikers remained upright, though one was badly wounded in the shoulder. They dismounted, taking cover behind a rock formation near the gate. The exchange of gunfire lulled momentarily, each side reloading and reassessing. Eve's heart pounded so loudly she could hardly hear. She took the brief lull to check her ammo. Sweat trickled down her brow, stinging her eyes. Then she saw headlights approaching from the main road. Officer Helena's patrol car screeched into view, sirens off but lights flashing in angry red and blue. The brightness cut through the darkness, illuminating the outlaws' hiding spot. One of them cursed and fired wildly at the cruiser, but Helena was no rookie. She threw the car into a fishtail maneuver, skidding behind a natural embankment for cover. Rejuvenated by the sight of backup, Eve repositioned, lining her rifle sights on the nearest outlaw. Through the scope, she could see the whites of his eyes as he realized his precarious position. She fired, catching him in the thigh. He dropped, weapon clattering to the ground. The remaining 2 bikers exchanged panicked glances. Sensing the tide had turned, Jacob called out, "Lay down your arms, this is over." One outlaw hesitated, gun trembling in his hand. The other sneered, hatred etched into every line of his face. Before he could lift his weapon, Helena opened fire from behind the embankment. He spun around, clutching a bleeding arm. The gun dropped with a dull thud onto the dirt. And just like that, the second wave was broken. A hush fell as the bikers moaned in pain or swore under their breath, dropping their weapons. Officer Helena cautiously emerged from her cruiser, gun drawn, to disarm them. Eve sank to her knees, lungs burning, relief and fear mingling in a dizzying haze. They had won again, at least for tonight. She closed her eyes, pressing a palm to her chest. How many more times would she have to defend this land with gunfire and grit? Her shoulder ached, her cheek stung, and her heart felt like it was 2 beats away from bursting. As Jacob and the others secured the captives, Eve found her gaze drifting to the orchard once more. Whatever she had started here, she was in it to the end. This was her home, and she'd defend it against any outlaw, wave after wave, until peace took root again. As the smoke clears over Crescent Gulch, one truth remains crystal clear. Never underestimate someone with nothing left to lose. Eve Beauregard, the ranch widow warrior, taught a ruthless biker gang, and all of us watching, that courage and conviction can overcome even the most dangerous threats. This story wasn't just about good versus evil. It was about honor, brotherhood, and fighting to protect the land and people we cherish. It's proof that, sometimes true heroes live quietly among us, waiting for the call to action. Now we turn the story over to you. What would you have done in Eve's boots? Did this tale of cowboy combat stir memories from your own life experiences? Leave a comment, join the conversation, and share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to catch more unforgettable stories from the Heartland.